would be probably better for me making this recording with reference to some notes so that I can. Anyway, I didn't make those notes, but it would probably be more useful if I could tag my remarks on exactly which parts of the Dave Rubin interview. And this is so bad, I'm not even going to use her name. But the libertarian candidate, or is it the Liberal Party? Oh my word, my ignorance. Anyway, after watching that interview with Dave Rubin, I have a lot of comments to make about what is, frankly, quite a disgusting sort of political performance, and it just doesn't work because it's unprincipled. So I agree with a lot of her reasoning on a lot of the policy platform that she expresses. Um, that's fine. But then when she makes kind of, let's say, cultural comments, talking about systemic racism, things like that, this just does not work because it actually contradicts her own platform, as it were, or it contradicts the reasoning that underpins her own platform. Because when she sympathizes with people who are downtrodden by systemic racism, uh, which is already a kind of a fundamentally convoluted concept. Not to mention also she perpetrates the same thing as where you cherry pick, sort of your interpretation of what's going on in order to conform to this idea that it's this kind of conditioned environmental influence. Now, when you're talking about these environmental influences, this is completely antithetical to responsibility, which is also, I think, a key point that she should have raised when she was talking about her idea on better drug policy of legalization, which would drive down the cost and which would increase the competition so that people would no longer be incentivized to go after children, to get hooked on drugs, because it would be such a functioning market that the margins would not be there. There wouldn't be an illicit market. It would be as hard for children to get a hold of alcohol because it's legal. So I'm very sympathetic to that argument. But what she kind of left out of that recipe is that also it doesn't necessarily mean that because it's legally permissive to obtain drugs, that it will become culturally permissive to obtain drugs, that there might still be cultural, moral norms, and the mores of society will then take on the role of policing that. And in some sense, because it won't be against the law, that morality will sort of reinforce with a notion of responsibility, that you are essentially responsible for your own fate. And when you start making vague, nebulous, sort of cherry-picked, weird descriptions of people that she wants to sound sympathetic to by saying, oh well, obviously if the biggest source of systemic racism is the government, so we should just, that just seems very opportunistic. I mean, that just seems very, very strange that, oh yeah, so you're going to plug into the democratic left wing, far left, sort of Marxist rhetoric, and you're going to opportunistically make yourself the solution to their narrative. It's slightly brain dead, because that whole echo chamber, or that whole way of framing society and framing problems in society, is antithetical to responsibility, is antithetical to free agency. It's all about an external locus of control. So the idea that she's trying to make herself more of a universal candidate by, sort of finding rhetoric that tries to tap into that sentiment and that, those. I mean, it's slightly disgusting, because what she is in fact doing is she's empowering the Democratic side of the aisle, as it were, or the Democratic Party in their far left, sort of weird, confected narrative. And I mean, I've seen examples of this happen when the Liberal Party in my country, which is the biggest opposition party in my country, South Africa, which is uh, even the biggest opposition party we don't have a two-party system. So, but I mean we have been completely dominated by a single political party, which is itself is a Congress, and within that political party has a smorgasbord of different sort of ideological tendencies, which is itself a bit strange. But anyway, the biggest political competitor is essentially a liberal party. It's actually called the Democratic Alliance in South Africa. And they used to be led by a politician who took the same opportunistic route of trying to plug into this populist sentiment of social justice. And it just doesn't work. Essentially, it's like, well, trust me to save the system. And like, let's put a liberal spin on it. And as I say, it corrupts the actual principles of the libertarian message, because it's antithetical to responsibility. It's fundamentally sort of the idea that you're going to take this ideological narrative, which is essentially hinged into scapegoating the problem, and essentially, so you're going to try to drive that very kind of resentfulness based sort of political sentiment, and you're going to be able to bring home the bacon to that constituency, that you're going to be able to sort of feed red meat to that, to that kind of political sentiment, that you're going to satiate their bloodthirst, essentially, which is essentially invested very heavily and very psychologically, very emotionally, on having to scapegoat something in order to compensate for the fact of this external locus of control, which is, when you believe in a narrative that is hinged on an external locus of control, it's fundamentally a kind of self-denigration. It's a kind of relinquishing of agency, in that seeing yourself as a conditioned sort of victim, or that your identity at least is a victim of systemic oppression. And then already, once you have invested into that kind of recipe, the only thing that can satiate you is to essentially hurt someone in the same way that you have kind of denigrated yourself in terms of your conceptual framework. So you've done it to yourself. And then that makes you a kind of trust parasite, where you have to destroy the notion of trust, that people cannot be responsible for navigating their life with their eyes open. They need to be able to trust in the cause of their identity as the way to liberate themselves, and that will always be cashed out as a kind of radical violence that compensates for the hurt and the damage that was done to the identity. So it's a restoration and a reclamation of a kind of identitarian pride, where pride becomes the kind of the main source of morality, and the main source of moral consideration. And so it's all about, a kind of envy based sort of redistribution, where the envy is kind of ideologically translated into a jealousy claim that it was something that was stolen from the identity, that it something that rightfully belongs to the identity that was stolen by the system. I mean, that's the psychology of what this stupid libertarian politician is trying to inculcate into her own messaging. I mean, it's just, I mean, there's a kind of, I mean, look, I can understand the cynical interest in trying to pander to both sides of the aisle, and so that you can try to be sort of a third party that can try to appeal to a broad universal base. Well, it's I mean, I think she's going to fail on both counts, because by already kind of throwing her hat into the kind of the talking points of this disgusting, poisonous um, ideological slant, uh, she's going to alienate, people that, don't just resonate with the reasoning in her policy, but actually, say, well, that there's a moral incoherency here, or there's incoherence on the level of principle. It doesn't add up. And just because you're telling me the right principles, you're going to force me to swallow, this kind of this lukewarm offering, because I'm supposed to agree with your cynical need to pander to the broadest sort of audience. And the people who the systemic oppression stuff sort of resonates with, they're not going to come over, because you're not offering them the red meat, as it were. Um, they need a pound of flesh. It's not, nothing else is going to do. Like, it's not about solving the problem. It's about confecting a description of a problem which is so confusing that you have to rely on the simplistic sort of redistributivist sort of retributivism that's at the core of their kind of vampire morality. um, so she's polluted her message. It really reminds me of the liberals in Weimar Germany that tried to placate and play ball with the Hitlerian, sort of ideological messaging. Um, that they didn't quite know how to rebuff that poisonous, sort of inception of the political arena. And it really reminds me of that, quite sadly. Um, and it's interesting. It's also quite disgusting, because she has to kind of cover her tracks in the same way that the Democratic people have to cover their tracks. They have to give this litany of so-called facts, which are highly contextualized, highly, it's sort of, is lies, and statistics, as they say. And all these like little pieces of their formulaic recipe of the narrative. And and the kind of, you know you end up having to, I mean, I've have long recordings where I kind of dissect the dishonesty that's baked into this kind of stuff, where essentially they will not actually look at the minutiae of what it is that they're using as evidence, and actually ask historically, why does this exist, why is this the way that it is. Somehow it's just, well, the system ends up being racist, so it doesn't matter, and so we can just say that there's a racist agency that the epoch belongs to, or something like that. Like, the time itself becomes inherited into a kind of identitarian um, oppression. It's that kind of racialized thinking. It's that kind of activation of the racialist imagination that sort of just becomes this hyperrealism. Um, this is a moral corruption. I mean, this is an unprincipled way of looking at things. It's fundamentally fudged. And to have someone who flies the libertarian flag sort of be actively engaged in this kind of murky, it's like watching, sort of black magic. It's like watching, um, it's these weird dirty tricks and sophistry, and it always has the same cadence of this, it's like I'm looking at a much better polished Kamala Harris, but that has, which, so I mean, I guess I'm not going to make psychological profiles and comparisons and things like that. I mean, I guess the only thing that saves this libertarian is the fact that her policies are indicating for the right moves in some sense, because then it doesn't matter what your personal feelings are in terms of because the government is no longer this coercive force, so it doesn't matter what your moral sentimentality is, um, because it will be transformed into a kind of benign. Because I mean, if she was given political power, she wouldn't exercise it um, to enforce her moral sentimentality or something like that. So it's like, it's just kind of ostentatious window dressing. It doesn't matter because of the libertarian schema that it's sort of attached to. And again, I mean, I've seen this played out in politics, and it ends up being a kind of self-contradiction on the moral level. And yeah, I mean, I guess I can't say much other than, this is a kind of this it makes her a kind of lukewarm sort of, it is almost as if, you lack a backbone, because you want to be able to craft a message that is very, very anti-Trump or something like that, so that you can help distinguish yourself in the field, and that you're sort of going to tap into, and what does that really mean? I mean, it just, so you're part of, I mean, it just looks like that. Then you're joining the chorus of the mainstream media in their very strange, hyperbolic, hyper interpreted, hyper contextualized, sort of bullshit factory, where it's all manufactured, artificial sentimentality. Um, and you've got their and you've adopted their talking points, and you've adopted their specious way of arguing. Um, which, I mean, look, I can even understand. I mean, in some sense, when this happened in South African politics, which was sort of, I can't actually give exactly a time frame, maybe 4 years ago or something like that. Um, that it was, that culture had not caught up, or at least the culture war had not developed well enough where these issues could come in clearer resolution. And still, it's a very uh, it's a very difficult, sort of set of moral issues, um, which is, they're confusing by design by their proponents and the adherents of so-called social justice. So, but in this day and age, in some sense, to not show the leadership of speaking up, in clearly on these issues, and having a more nuanced take on these things. Um, because there is a version of what she is trying to do which you could argue. You could say, well, if there is such a thing as systemic racism, it's predominantly being promulgated through government or something like that, and therefore, if there was a more libertarian government, um, the morality of the people and the market would, I don't know, if there's a variant of being able to kind of make the point that she wants to make, of the fact that her route would satisfy more people or something like that, or would deal with the heart of the problem that is being described. But yeah, I mean, she's basically polluted her. I mean, in some sense, especially where we are in terms of the culture war, I would say at some point she has polluted her personality in the sense that now she has earmarked herself. She has designated herself as being essentially a useful idiot for, you know, she classifies it as Marxist ideology. I would just call it proto-fascist ideology, because that's exactly what the complaint of systemic racism is. It's no different from the Jewish conspiracy that the Nazis complained about. But anyway, I'm not going to go and elaborate on that parallel, but it is ideologically the same thing. Um, it has the same function, and it stops people from being able to develop self-confidence, because they can never grow in their competencies, because they can't navigate life by generating or curating an individual trust that they are responsible for maintaining and managing, because they're told that they must just trust in the ideological narrative and trust in their identity and trust in the cause of the identity as a way to filter reality. And that is the only way in which systemic oppression makes any sense. That is the only way to see society, through that racialized lens. And this woman has just completely conceded to that. She's just leaned into that racial imagination, as it were, uh, seemingly unwittingly. I mean, she does it. She doesn't languish in it. She does it just enough to try to sort of, I guess, virtue signal uh, to people on the left, so that she can try to have a wider publicity pool or whatever, or a wider. But yeah, I mean, it's to completely misread, I think, the importance of, let's say, these cultural issues, and also which have become political issues, especially in how the kind of the institutional capture has sort of escalated, because that's what this ideology does: is it corrupts executive power, it corrupts institutions. It's like fascist morality. That's exactly what it is, and she is using its messaging like a useful idiot. So I guess now I'm just repeating myself, so I'll stop this recording. But the thing that I wanted to point out is that, I mean, I agree with all of her reasoning and her policy, but the thing that she left out when she spoke about legalizing drugs, and how that would lead to a better control of the drug, uh, and a more peaceful, and a less, and you wouldn't be taking people to jail, is that essentially it would also make culture more prominent in essentially inculcating a sense of responsibility, that because if it's not against the law, but it still has to be known that these drugs, still have very negative side effects, but then the only thing stopping people is themselves, or a medical intervention, when they've already sort of crossed the line of no return, and they can't help themselves, perhaps. But I mean, certainly it's a bit of a touchy subject, but I just thought it was conspicuous that you didn't speak about personal responsibility or individual responsibility, and in terms of or to some extent, the cultural, um, the societal mores, the norms in a society, that would then have to be the thing that designates accountability for being susceptible to that kind of thing, um, or for not crossing the line and becoming, um, or in terms of maintaining a taboo against. I mean, there are many places in which, I mean, Amsterdam and marijuana, where it's legal, there is a cultural taboo against smoking marijuana, and that's the kind of thing that develops when you have a legally permissive society, is that then culture, uh, people actually, it matters what the cultural consensus is to some degree, but also that that cultural consensus uh, creates a certain pressure that then becomes the feeling of individual responsibility in terms of, well, it is widely known that if you dabble in these substances, bad things can happen, and it's a knowledge within culture, and it's a kind of it's a taboo, and that is almost the healthiest sort of compromise that you can get to in terms of actually generating, that essentially, I mean, I understand that this is used in it, but I think that a culture of life, in some sense, can only be sustained and arrived at through a kind of through a genuine and authentic compromise in which culture is empowered with uh, the role of describing, as being the sole description of, um, this is not quite the right word, but sort of to de-incentivize the a behavior or the use of something. That culture is the thing that is actually the the only boundary the only boundary that is being created is through culture, and that boundary is not enforced by legal, um, that essentially culture can have structures in it which are not enforceable by anything other than just cultural regard itself. And that until sort of culture gets to that point of not, it's not reverence, it's not absolute reverence for culture, but it is the respect that the moral fabric of a society, um, means something, and it only means something because that is what it is, not because it's enforceable, not because it manifests through, government coercion, essentially, or through some organ of the state, but that culture is actually, um, calibrating and interfacing with people's decision making in their own minds, in their own thinking, in their own discerning, in terms of an internal dialogue, which is something like what actual responsibility means. And I think that we get closer to that description of a society if we do go that way. Okay, I've just done it in a kind of very verbose way, but I do think that was that sense of responsibility, or cultivating that culture of responsibility, was left out of her drug thing. But also, if she did put in that bit of responsibility, it would completely undermine all this virtue signaling that she does on the level of, of systemic oppression, because complaining about systemic oppression in that way is completely antithetical to that level of taking responsibility, because that those kinds of mechanics are just completely destroyed when you believe that there's this kind of external locus of control, that you are conditioned by your environment, um, especially in the weird confection and nebulousness in which the description of systemic oppression just kind of puts the cart before the horse. It's like it's the complaint about an outcome when you're not that interested in actually defeating the ingredients of what led to that outcome, because you're not interested in why those ingredients exist, but just they exist together as a group noun conditioning or something like that. And so you just want to believe in the generalization. You just want to say, well, the generalization itself is the cause of the unfairness, and it's not a description of cause, or it's certainly not an explanation. It's just a description, and it's a description that is completely, it's a false reduction, and it's convenient if you want to languish in an external locus of control and never have the access to generating your own self-confidence. So I mean, yeah, so it's ugly watching a so-called libertarian virtue signal in that way, and it completely dismantles her own moral, principled platform. Okay, now I'm just repeating myself, so I'll stop this recording. But yeah, it's and I think that lack of leadership on these kinds of principles of the day, you could say, or I've said this as well to Brett Weinstein. You know that I find it almost inexcusable that people should not take Trump's side just because of the narrative that has been crafted in terms of very speciously contextualizing the remarks that the president has made, to just label him with blanket accusations of racism and things like that. I mean, you know, it's that kind of bullshit that is why we can't have a richer policy debate, and why the Democratic Party can just make their whole platform about outrageous, hyperbolic, sort of just it's just why the policy debate always stays in this kind of low resolution is because people allow this noise to creep in. I mean, if any president ever was more vulnerable than Trump on being able to answer the actual issues. I mean, like Trump, what I mean by that is that Trump was an open door to debating policy. If the Democrats actually went after him because they had a better platform, and that the substance of Trump's campaign or his presidency was lacking, you know if someone decided to go after Trump on some kind of substantive issue, Trump would actually be there having to defend the substance of it, if there was a real argument made against it. Because the arguments made against him are so sort of low resolution, trumped up, hyped up, sort of garbage. It's but if ever there was a president who would have been prone to being engaged on, on substance, I can't think of a president, who just think about it. If someone sort of tried to take a realism approach to Trump and say, well, actually, the deficit is growing or something like that. I mean, the kinds of arguments, I guess, that the libertarian candidate raised. If that was the position of the Democratic Party, I mean, I do think actually some of her criticism, some of the libertarian criticism, is sort of slightly trumped up, because it's sort of like, well, how can you arbitrate over these issues? Like, can you really blame you know, it's like you really want to know, well, would you be able to actually do a better job under these conditions? You know, when like, I mean, if you want to blame Trump for the lockdown, you know, like that seems slightly unfair, because I mean, I would say that the only reason why there was a lockdown in America was because Trump would not have been able to survive the media onslaught of going against, you know, the so-called experts at the time, which, I mean, to me, I found, because I mean, in March, even before March, I could find the voices of experts who have not stopped in saying what they're saying, and I've just been repeating what they've been saying the whole time, which is that, you know, Sweden is the only responsible response to COVID-19 or SARS-CoV-2. Okay, I'm going on a bit too much, but so what was the point that I was trying to get to? That, you know, that there is a kind of, there's a bit of a lack of realism in what in some of the charges that the libertarian candidate makes against Trump. But in some sense, if we had a more responsible media landscape, if we had a more responsible, you know, if people actually interviewed the actual experts, you know, on epidemiology and such, Professor Leonidas from Stanford, Professor Suneta Gupta from Oxford, the people from Sweden, uh, which, you know, you don't see them interviewed by any sort of serious television. Their voices have been completely suppressed, um, because they would completely deflate the narrative that the media has been weaving. Um, I mean, it's quite disgusting. Anyway, so what am I saying? Is that, I mean, you know, I guess the Democratic Party, and therefore also the journalistic establishment, decided that this was going to be an exceptional presidency in which substance was never going to come into the picture. They decided that because I guess they were just so afraid of the whole tone of political discourse becoming about substance and realism. Um, and Trump was going to slay too many sacred cows. You know, I mean, that they took this approach to him to try to sort of obtusely repudiate uh, uh, everything that his campaign and that his presidency stood for, um, because they were not willing to meet him substantively. You know, they tried to just basically eject him from the Overton window, and you know, and this is a real condition that the Trump presidency has been under, and I must say it has not been helped when people sort of just parrot and echo the trumped up hyperbole and the media narrative about Trump. It's disgusting. Um, and then, you know, at the same time, you have the identity politics, witch hunts, and poisonousness. And then you have a libertarian candidate essentially pandering. And where is her leadership, you know, on these sorts of issues? So she's trying to say that she's a better Trump, but you know, that she would actually be a substantive outsider, to what's going on. Well, I mean, already I can see, uh, a kind of superficial uh, lapse in judgment, let's just say, and a kind of and there's a certain kind of substantive gap, which is, sort of, I mean, I guess, I mean, I wonder how much of this sort of substantive gap in terms of the moral principle of the matter is part and parcel of her kind of, I mean, it is true that identity politics and the rhetoric of identity politics is sort of wedded to this kind of political entrepreneurialism, and this kind of opportunism of being able to exploit people in their sort of sentimentality. Um, anyway, I've probably gone on. I was about to weave that into another point, but I don't want to continue languishing on. But yeah, there is a visceral grittiness to Trump, which would have been very regenerative, and it would have rejuvenated the political arena if people tried to engage Trump on substance. But it was sort of already pre-decided that that would not happen because the Democratic Party is essentially structured atop lies. It is built on deception and a kind of ideological subterfuge and a kind of social manipulation. And then you see a so-called libertarian candidate plugging herself into that propaganda machine, essentially, to try to siphon off some level of support. It's what does that say about her leadership, or her sort of vision or foresight? It's I mean, it's distasteful to me. I mean, I'm an outside observer, but and I mean, I think I'll be vindicated in the longer term. In the over the longer period, I think that people will look back and they will realize just how evil this ideology was, and sort of how embarrassing it is for the people who sort of plugged into it to try to ride the wave of sort of what I think will become to be seen as a kind of proto-fascistic populism, of this kind of, that we can just cling to our sentiments, and as long as we have this vague ideological outline, our outrage and our sentiments become sanctified. We can indulge in them freely, and they are signs of our virtuosity. In this very superficial based moral system, which allows you to kind of make certain gaps in your substantive processing, in your interpretation of reality, which I'm seeing a bit too much of that in this libertarian candidate. And it's sort of, it's interesting because even though I agree with all of her reasoning, it's just, I would consider these kinds of moral deficits in principle, and then character deficits as well. Because I do think it is a bit of a, if this psychologically appeals to, if this stuff of talking about systemic racism, if that appeals to you on any level, it's either a cognitive deficit in that you don't understand, you haven't thought it through quite clearly enough, at just how convoluted that worldview is and how it forces you to essentially reify external locuses of control, which are fundamentally antithetical to cultivating responsibility, and also forever being able to generate confidence that isn't given to you via some kind of weird abstraction like the cause of your identity, that doesn't come in the form of a kind of anti-racism project. And the fact that she doesn't get that, in inverted commas, um, and then I guess I'm seeing similar kinds of convenient, expedient forms of interpreting charges against Trump. And I'm not just saying this because I'm more compassionate to Trump's um, candidacy to be president again. I mean, I guess in some sense, uh, I mean, I morally support Trump because uh, he is indispensable for the culture war. Um, and the kind of and the attacks. I mean, I guess I support Trump because of how he is attacked and the clear dishonesty in how Trump is attacked. That they call him like a Nazi because he is for a civic nationalism, which is literally premised in how he has expressed it and how he endorses it in non-racialism. I mean, the attacks on Trump are attacks on non-racialism. It's disgusting. And he is there taking these blanket accusations, um, and demonstrating and illustrating the bad faith that they are made through or from. And that is a necessary and indispensable, learning experience that we need as a sort of culture. And if anything, it's necessary for, in the long term, the restitution of the Democratic Party, if they can actually have the dignity and have the integrity enough to allow themselves to sort of to reinvent, their moral fiber, because it's all chaff. It's just it's a very sort of feeble groupthink of sort of assumed and asserted superiority, um, which the tokens of that superiority are just so superficial, um, and premised in this kind of delusional narrative, and welded to being able to kind of project this narrative on anyone, no matter how badly it fits. And that is what the media does. I mean, it's so hard to imagine just how far. I mean, CNN didn't used to be this. I guess perhaps I don't know, because I only used to watch, um, the international CNN, which was just sort of anchors. Perhaps that was before news kind of changed its character, but I mean, yes, obviously they had editors, and kind of editorial uh, interpretations of. I guess it was hard for me to judge what the commentary meant on the domestic politics, in America. Anyway, let me stop this recording before it gets more embarrassing.